Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's MLA's Productivity and Profitability webinar. These webinar series deliver topics pertinent to beef and sheep producers. My name is Hilary and I work for the webinar coordinators Aggregate Consulting. Tonight's topic is livestock assessment and selection. We're joined both by Peta Bradley of MLA and Angus Burnett-Smith of Classymate to talk us through the genetic and visual aspects of assessment and selection. This is our last webinar for 2021, so I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who jumps on every second Wednesday night to join us. We will be continuing in the new year, but that won't be until February, so we look forward to seeing you again then. All the webinars are recorded and available on the MLA website. So if you want to go and have a look through the 2021 content, it'll all be on the MLA website. Just a bit of housekeeping to get started. This control panel will be at the top hand corner of your screen. The red arrow button on the left collapses and reinstates the control panel if you want to get a better look at your screen this evening. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. As Peter and Angus go through their presentations this evening, please type your questions in the box provided. I will relay them to them at the end of the webinar. So both after Peter and Angus have presented, we will then kick into some questions. So please make your questions as succinct as possible. And if you have a specific question for a specific presenter, please make sure you include that in your question so I can direct them accordingly. To introduce our speakers this evening, Peta Bradley from MLA is a livestock genetics project manager with MLA based in Armidale. Prior to this, she had been working with the sheep genetics team at Merino Select as a Merino Select development officer and then senior development officer. She completed a Bachelor of Rural Science at the University of New England in 2017, which included an honours project in the genetic parameter estimation of reproductive traits in sheep. In her current role as project manager, she is responsible for driving the progress of the investments into genetic research, development and adoption that have been developed through the National Livestock Genetics Consortium, NLGC. Peta grew up on a property near Armatree in central west New South Wales, where her family run a commercial and stud sheep operation alongside a cropping enterprise, and has had extensive experience in the sheep and wool industry throughout her education and career. So we're very lucky to have Peta with us this evening, taking us through the genetic aspects of livestock assessment and selection. And then we have Angus Burnett-Smith. Angus was born in Rhodesia and immigrated to Australia with his family in 1985, where they ran a cropping and livestock enterprise in South Australia's southeast. With a solid understanding of the value of African genetics and their suitability to the Australian conditions, the Burnett-Smith family identified some key additions that would benefit the Australian ag sector. With that, Tarawina Goat and Dorper Stud was founded and began the task of navigating the process of introducing elite studs seed stock to Australia from the African continent. Following the required extensive import protocols and quarantine, Tarawina Stud became globally recognised as a provider of elite seed stock and genetic material to the world market. And this provided Angus with the opportunity to travel extensively, both as a livestock judge and visiting breeder to a variety of overseas markets, and gain a broader perspective on successful marketing concepts and how they might be applied in Australia. With a tangible understanding of the benefits of structural assessment, Angus recently founded Classymate and spent the best part of 4 years refining the world's first livestock visual assessment tool. The concept is designed to assist breeders in effectively and accurately visually appraising their livestock. The platform is now nearing completion and ready for a release in early 2022. Very exciting stuff, and we're very lucky to also have Angus with us this evening. I'm going to kick off with Peter. I'll make you the presenter now, and we can get into the presentation for this evening.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Just checking you've got my screen.
It's just thinking. Yep.
No problem at all.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction, Hilary. As Hilary mentioned, I'm the project manager for the livestock genetics portfolio with Meat and Livestock Australia. And this evening, in the short session that I have, I'll be going through harnessing the power of genetic selection applicable to both sheep and beef. So quickly, this evening, we'll be going through why I use breeding values when selecting sires, how to put them and apply them in practice, and then a little bit more on how you can access breeding values for both sheep and beef for your ram and bull purchases. So why use breeding values? I'll quickly cover off why genetics, or why I see genetics as like cars, what impacts the performance of a sire, and how those breeding values look under the hood of the animal. So why genetics is like cars, it's under the hood that matters. So I always like to use this analogy. I was a bit of a Top Gear fan growing up, and I don't know if anyone else can recall, but there was an episode where the Australian Top Gear presenters and the British Top Gear presenters had to bring a vehicle that tradesmen drive in their country for a drags race. So of course the Aussie presenters, they brought along the Holden Maloo ute, which looks pretty good, and they thought they had it in the bag, particularly when the UK presenters rocked up and they had this Ford Transit van. On appearance alone, if you were asked to pick the car that would win the drag race, you'd probably go with the Maloo just on appearance. But what the Aussie presenters didn't know was that the UK presenters actually had tweaked the engine of the Ford Transit van. So whilst the Maloo was a V8, 6-litre V8, putting out a fair bit of horsepower, once the UK presenters had tweaked with the Ford Transit van, it was actually a twin turbo V6, putting out a lot more horsepower. And needless to say, but the Poms won that drag race. So I like to use this analogy a little bit with genetics, because it's actually the genetics that an animal carries that's going to be passed on to the offspring, not just how that animal looks on sale day, that's going to be important to drive the productivity of your business. So if we think about whether you're purchasing a bull or a ram, the performance of an animal or how it presents for sale day is a combination of two things. It's the genetics of that animal, but also the environmental factors that have influenced how that animal presents. So if we think of a sheep, for example, there are a lot of things that will influence how a ram might present on the day of sale, being the feed availability that animal's had, if it's had preferential feed to others, for example, that might be presented at the same sale, the age of the animal. So we know that animals, even within a 6-week joining period, the animals that were born at the start, at that 1-year-old mark, roughly when they were being sold, they're still going to be heavier, or on average be heavier than those that were born towards the end of the lambing. So that is influencing how an animal looks, but that difference in size isn't going to be passed on to the progeny because it's not influenced by the genetics of the animal. We also know that birth type and rear type, so whether an animal is born or a single or twin, has a lifelong influence on how that animal will look, and also the age of the dam. So if that was a maiden ewe, or in the case of cattle, a heifer that's had that animal, they will appear different to animals out of more mature animals. So we've also, then there's the factor that we know will be passed on to the offspring of the animal, and that are the genes of the animal. And that's what we're interested in, because that's what's going to be passed on when we buy that sire and take him home. So it's really important to remember that it's not just how that animal looks, it's the genes that will be passed on. So how do breeding values actually do that? So breeding values are what we use to describe the genes that an animal carries. And we do that through your ram or bull breeders submitting a whole range of performance data that accounts for that environmental component. Submitting that to either sheep genetics for sheep or breed plan for beef, and we calculate breeding values that describe the genes of the animal. So examples of data that those bull and ram breeders are submitting are things like the performance of the animal itself, so how heavy it is compared to its contemporaries, the performance of its sire, dam, siblings, both full siblings and half siblings. The system that is used to calculate breeding values also takes into account other information such as the heritability of the trait, so how much of the trait is due to the environment versus the genes of an animal. What other traits are correlated? So, for example, in sheep, we know that fleece weight and micron are antagonistically correlated. So if you increase fleece weight, generally your micron will increase as well. So we take into account information from correlated traits. The breeder also describes the environment, and they do that by saying which animals have been run under the same environmental conditions, which animals have been treated as contemporaries. And more recently, in our evaluations to calculate breeding values, we're using genomic or DNA information taken from an animal. So all of these factors go in to calculate breeding values so that what you're buying or using on sale day is exactly or what we expect the genes of that animal to carry. So that's why we use breeding values in selections, because it's looking under the hood of an animal and seeing what will be passed on to its progeny. But how do we do that in practice? So in this section, I'll be going through understanding and interpreting breeding values, and then also using our breeding objectives and indexes in selection decisions. So understanding breeding values. So we do have acronyms. So in sheep, you'll often hear breeding values referred to as ASBVs, or Australian Sheep Breeding Values. And in the beef space, you'll hear EBVs, Estimated Breeding Values. Now it's important not to forget that breeding values are based around the number of 0, and that sometimes negative breeding values are not always bad. And a really good example of this is a trait where we want less. So for example, worm egg count, we want less worms, so a more negative breeding value is favourable. Whereas with our growth traits, we're wanting more growth, so a higher breeding value is favoured. You'll often see breeding values published with a number underneath, and that's the accuracy. Now, it's important not to get too hung up on the accuracy if you're purchasing many animals or a team of animals. But essentially, all the accuracy is a reflection of the amount of information used, or all those pieces of data that a breeder will capture that's gone into the calculation of that ASBV or EBV. And it's important to remember that we're not just comparing that animal's breeding value with the base of 0 that breeding values are based around, but it's important to compare it to the current drop animals. So, for example, we use percentile bands to compare animals born in 2020 with other animals born around the country in the same year drop. So as an example here, I've included a screenshot of some ASBVs from the Sheep Genetics website. So you'll see that these are acronyms, and there's more information available on what each of these mean. You'll see the breeding value or index on this first row, the accuracy, which again is that how much information has gone into that calculation of that breeding value, and then below you'll see where that animal sits in a percentile band. So for example, using this trait NLW, or number of lambs weaned, this animal sits in the top 5% of the current drop for that trait. We have a wide range, both in sheep and beef, of breeding values available depending on the traits that are important to your objective. So I've listed here the 6 main categories of breeding values that we have. There are new breeding values in development all the time for new and emerging traits such as net feed intake and even methane. But covering off on the key traits that we have available now, there's a number of health and welfare traits. I mentioned one previously in sheep, that's worm egg count. We've also got growth traits. So in beef, if people are familiar with EBVs, we have 200, 400 and 600 day weight In sheep, we have weaning weight, post-weaning weight, yearling weight to describe the growth of the animal. Obviously only applicable for sheep. We do have a range of wool traits, including fleece weight, micron, and then also quality attributes like CV are described in wool breeding values. Both beef and sheep have reproductive traits available. So obviously these are different because sheep, we do have the added complexity of multiple litters or multiple animals in a litter. But there are a number of component traits for reproduction available for sheep. We also have traits like days to calving, EBVs available for the beef side. Both sheep and beef have carcass and eating quality breeding values available, including intramuscular fat, right through to carcass weight and lean meat yield. And there's also breeding values that describe the genes an animal carries for visual and structural traits. So a good example here is in sheep, we have visual traits that describe wool quality and also traits like wrinkle. So we do have an early breech wrinkle breeding value, which people are using in their breeding objective to breed for sheep with less wrinkle and therefore are less likely to be using. So that's just a very quick snapshot on the different breeding values that are available. Again, we can go into more information. There's more information later on in the presentation about where you can access information on how to interpret these. So as an example, I've got two rams here of how we use breeding values to compare animals. So we've got ram A, and we have a Y weight ASBV. So this is a yearling weight Australian sheep breeding value, and this animal has a breeding value of 10.6. And that was used by a sheep genetics client last year or in 2020. So and on the x-axis we have our clean fleece weight breeding value, and on the so we want to be sitting down the y-axis, down the bottom of the y-axis. And we know that these traits are antagonistically correlated. Generally, if you increase wool cut, your sheep get wrinklier. But because people have been using breeding values in their selection and in using that in combination with indexes and their overall breeding objective, we've actually been able to somewhat buck that trend. And we've actually now got a range of animals that the red line represents the average for both traits, so the average early breech wrinkle and the average clean fleece weight. And you can see down in this bottom right-hand quadrant, there's a whole heap of different sires that are actually above average for fleece weight and below average for breech wrinkle. So this is a really good example of how we can use breeding values in our selection a list of animals that you're thinking of considering or a sale catalogue, using that index to sort through and rank from highest to lowest. Now we understand that once you've done that, then an animal can have a high index that might not necessarily have the traits that are desirable. So indexes are a very useful filtering tool, but it's also important to look at the individual traits or breeding values that are important to your business. Once you've done that, you've actually end up with a short list of animals that you can take for the sale. And it's really important that breeding values are still used in conjunction with visual appraisal of animals. So breeding values describe the genes that that animal will pass on to its offspring, but we need to make sure that that animal that you're purchasing, be it bull or ram, is structurally sound and can do the job for you. So it's important to take that short list of animals using your index and trait filtering to the sale, but digital appraisal either via Auction Plus videos or your other auction sites, or obviously if you do attend the sale in person, to look at the animals to ensure that they're fit for purpose. Now, finally, now that we've done a quick snapshot on why breeding values are important and how to use them and use selection indexes, I just thought I'd quickly run through accessing breeding values for both rams and bulls and the different sites that you can use, and then just generally where to go to for more information on breeding values. So for ram buyers, the one-stop shop for your information or breeding values on rams is the Sheep Genetics search site. I have the address there, and when you go to that site, you'll see something quite similar to this that allow you to sort through and search what type of animal you're looking for and match that to your objective. It's important to note that if you are a buyer, you can log in or create an account where you can save searches. So if you go looking for some animals and you have an account created, you can save that search to your account so you can go back and look at that at a later time. Once you have done a search, you can see, you will see a page not too dissimilar to this that we saw before with indexes and percentile rankings. You can also toggle around and change the way you'd like those breeding values displayed if you prefer a more graphic representation. For beef, if you are purchasing bulls, the breed plan search login site, and then there is a list of all the different breed plan analyses depending on what breed of bull you're looking to purchase. So if you're looking for an Angus bull or a Hereford bull or a Brahman bull, you can scroll through the list and find a search site for the bull breed that you are interested in. Once you have done that and done a search, you'll see breeding values displayed obviously in two ways again, like the Sheep Genetics site where we do have the numbered breeding values, but there's also this visual percentile graph display showing where that animal sits in relation to other animals born from that same year drop. That was a very, very quick snapshot of all things breeding values that I've gone through this evening. But if you are interested in more information, everything from understanding breeding values more to setting a breeding objective to more about the different traits that are available for both sheep and beef, I recommend jumping onto genetics.mla.com.au. There's actually a range of case studies of other commercial producers that have used breeding values to improve productivity, as well as short how-to videos that don't go for more than a couple of minutes on each of the different topics that you might be interested in. So really recommend jumping on and checking that out if you'd like to know more about breeding values. But just as a quick wrap up, I guess the three take-home messages from this evening is that breeding values will allow you to assess the genes that an animal will pass on to its progeny, because we know how an animal presents for sale day can be influenced by a lot of different environmental factors. Coming back to that breeding objective conversation, it's really important to know those traits that do influence profit in your business and link them to indexes. And follow the steps to shortlisting animals to go and visually appraise for sale. And again, check out the Sheep Genetics and Breed Plan websites for more information on breeding values, and also to access breeding values on rams or bulls that you might be interested in. I've also included contact details there, so if anyone does have any questions following this evening's webinar, please feel free to reach out. Thanks, Hilary.
Great, thanks so much for that, Peter. Apologies anyone, I just have had a massive storm go over, so hopefully it didn't affect your viewing this evening, but please let me know if it did, and we can revisit some of Peter's points. I'll just make Angus the presenter now. Angus, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Hilary. Yeah, I'm assuming you can see my screen there and hear me?
Yep, off you go. Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much, Hilary and MLA, for putting on these webinars, and it's a great privilege to be able to show you a little bit about what I've been up to. I won't spend any time talking about myself here. Suffice to say that I hope to demonstrate a visual assessment tool that will help breeders navigate the challenges of visual assessment. I won't go too much into detail about the particulars of visual assessment, but I hope to at least trigger another way of thinking in the process. Just a little background. So the current status of visual assessment in my mind is that it's a massively underutilized tool. There's significant breed development data that's not being captured. There's data analysis that's being lost, and there's huge opportunities for purchase and breed development decision making that we're not properly utilizing. With that said, there obviously are opportunities for visual assessment. There's a vast variety of visual assessment tools that breeders have either produced themselves or breeding groups have embarked on to utilize. But from my experience, they're not necessarily comparable from one operation to another. They're totally subjective. Most of them require independent assessment, which obviously comes with logistics and a huge cost. I haven't found many that produce much framework for breeders to work with to assist in the process of visual assessment, and it's often very difficult to manage the time benefit of the process. So through my years of livestock breeding, I've considered that there must be a better way, and I took on the task of building what I hope is a useful tool that provides breeders with a tool that's measurable, comparable. It utilizes objectiveness. In my mind, visual assessment is never going to be totally objective, but it takes giant leaps in that direction. It removes personal biases, and more importantly, it's got to be fast and accurate. So that was the criteria that we embarked on at the start of the project. There's multiple reasons to assess stock, and most breeders tuning in would be aware of these. In particular, breed development and for marketing purposes. Those are the obvious points. But what I would like to see is a situation where if the process of visual assessment becomes more reliable and more robust, then it actually opens new opportunities for further use. So what I've tried to do is capture some of the objectiveness that the collection of EBVs has, and if you can make components of structural assessment measurable, then they become comparable. So it actually helps you balance the use of EBVs. I was delighted to hear Peter use the analogy of the cars. I use that also. So if Peter's responsibility is to look under the hood, my responsibility is to look at the phenotype, and we make little to no effort to look under the hood as part of this process. There's also opportunities for livestock evaluation when you can actually independently quantify the quality of an animal, and also genetic material sales. So if you're able to accumulate data on the performance of a bull, for example, then the semen that he produces is far more marketable long after the bull's lifespan. And also individual brand development in terms of marketing your own stock and developing a reputation as a quality breeder. So, as I've said, visual assessment does occur, but in a fairly limited way through livestock agents. There's judging at agricultural shows. Some breed societies, certainly some progressive breeders embark on their own visual assessment, but generally I've found that it's significantly overlooked. So without going into too much detail, I thought it'd be useful to give some timeline as to what this process is. In 2015, we built a online marketplace which required livestock to be independently assessed into a marketplace that allowed overseas buyers to purchase them sight unseen based on their independent assessment for the purposes of export. And that initially was tremendously successful, but we were quickly challenged by things like the size of the country and the logistics of getting independent assessors around, and also the time required. We would get huge demand for export and couldn't physically assess animals in the space allowed. So part of that observation was that in a lot of cases, a lot of the breeders we're dealing with are actually fully equipped to appraise their own livestock to a very high quality standard, but just didn't have the framework to do so. So there's no opportunity for them to say this animal's better than that animal, apart from making verbal recommendations. In 2017, we embarked on the development of the Classimate app, as it now stands, which allows breeders and independent classifiers to appraise livestock to a uniform standard, and following the key framework that we've developed. So the app is very nearly finished. We're in the final stages of beta testing and bug fixing, and we hope to have it released in 2022. What I'd like to do, if the technology guides allow us, is to actually give you a live demonstration on how the app works. But a couple of features that I won't have time to draw on here, but I thought I'd run through, obviously that the app is designed to be very fast and have an intuitive workflow. So the last thing you want to be doing as part of your assessment, which you may or may not be currently doing, is adding another significant task to your day. So one of the criteria was that if using Classimate as a visual assessment tool is slower than traditional assessments, then we've missed the mark. So we've tried to make it a seamless integration. It'll accumulate the data and generate real-time scores crush side. It'll immediately record the information you provided and generate reports. As I said, it's got the ability to provide independent or breeder assessment modules. So you can actually walk out and appraise your stock once a day for the rest of your life. And if a user is able to view that stock, it'll be denoted as self-assessed. Or you can invite an independent assessor onto the property who'll actually gain access to your database, and they'll use the same criteria and accumulate the same data, but it'll be denoted as classified, which means that an independent assessor has actually viewed the stock. Classimate also provides livestock transfers and peer-to-peer feedback reviews. So if you actually assess stock for the purposes of an upcoming sale, you're actually able to transfer the animal record to the purchaser, and they'll get all the assessment information from the lifetime of the animal, and they'll actually have the opportunity to say, I bought this, say on Auctions Plus, I received the animal, and I believed it to be scored this, and the assessment was true and correct, and they'll be able to provide a review. So it actually builds a situation where there's some accountability for the quality of assessment. So those are widely recognised processes in today's digital age. And we currently offer 5 different criteria. So beef, cattle, meat, sheep, meat, goats, dairy cattle, and dairy goats. They're in various stages of development, but those are the early focuses. And what we'd like to do is refine those down to individual breeds with the collaboration of breeders as we get out to the marketplace. So what I'll do, if you just bear with me here, is actually get my phone up on the screen. There we go. Okay, so this is a working example of the ClassiMate app. I'll just show you a couple of key features. There's no time to go through all of them, but basically it's a very easy to follow layout. You've got your stock available on your screen. You can actually post ads if there's stock for sale, and there's some quite intricate functionalities. But to get to the core of the matter, you can actually visit your stock list. Your stock can either be uploaded through your desktop via spreadsheet, or you can do it crush-side individually, and you can filter them by breed type. So these are just example databases. All the animals with an orange score have been assessed, and the orange ribbon is actually denotes that it's been classified. So that animal's been classified by an independent assessor, and if you generate a certificate through the app, it'll mention that. It'll mention the date and the assessor's name. So the top bull here has not yet been assessed, so we can open him up. There's no data there yet, but we can assess the animal. So you can see we're using the bull selection criteria. There's also a beef criteria, but in this case we're using a bull selection criteria. And what ClassiMate does is utilize industry accepted criteria. So this is a variation from ideal basis. So the orange square in the middle would indicate that trait, that you've identified that trait as ideal, and any variation to the left or right penalizes the score to a different degree. And you'll notice that anyone in the industry would recognize these traits and those graphs. We've tried to not reinvent the wheel. We try and apply existing accepted criteria. So you have the opportunity to either make entries at each level. You might say that the head of this animal's ideal. You might say there's a little bit of angle to the shoulders of this bull. Might be slightly knock-kneed. Each trait will contribute to the score to a different degree. So if you penalise the head, it'll make some difference to the score, but if you penalise the shoulders, it's going to make a more significant difference. So you can actually roll down the screen and make your assessments individually, or you can use what we call the wizard, which will actually present the traits to you one by one in the order that you'd be looking at them. So you can make an entry and it'll flick to the next trait. So front legs, claws, I'll just go through quickly. It's quite a useful exercise to do in the yard with the breeder, because it actually confirms or challenges their assumptions of their own animals, which is always an excellent exercise. Muscle score. Okay, so that is the basis of the assessment. So we've gone through the primary traits and we click submit. And with the love of technology, app crashes as per usual. That's why it's not yet launched. What I'll do, that scored that animal 5.35 out of a possible 10, and he would have scored much better had we awarded all his traits an ideal status. So the other level of assessment here is to actually drill down into another layer. So this bull has been assessed, and there's his assessment scores, but you might have more significant faults. So the bottom section is, does the animal have any critical traits? So if you open this section, these are traits that you'd only penalise on rare occasions. So the animal might be fine reproductively, so you'd say there's no reproductive issues. Animal might not have any colour defects, or you might not be interested in appraising the colour. Animal does meet the breed standard. Animal might have a shoulder issue, so you can say yes, and then you can pick the degree of the shoulder issue. So you might say it's a moderate issue. So that's penalised the score quite heavily there. So what you can then do with the data is actually generate what we call a share graph, which is immediately available, and that'll itemize exactly how you've assessed the animal, the date you've assessed it, the person who assessed it, and down the bottom you'll see a red critical trait there, denoting that the animal was penalised for a problem in its shoulders. So it really does provide a fairly handy snapshot for buyers to make quick decisions, or at least identify animals that they need to drill more closely into. That can then be texted, shared, emailed to whoever you like. So or posted on social media or whatever you like to do. So that's a shareable graph. A lot of breeders actually print them out and use them as lot cards, which is a fairly useful tool. I'll also just show you quickly some of the features of the meat sheep. So the meat sheep assessment is obviously different again. It actually is slightly more intricate. Small ruminants seem to have a more comprehensive assessment as part of their criteria. So it's a slightly longer assessment that requires a few more entries. What we've actually done here to speed the process up is provided an all ideals option. So you can actually select all ideals, which means if I press the mitt there, the animal would score a perfect 10. But what it actually allows you to do is if you're assessing, say your sales stock, and they in theory the top end of your herd or your flock, you can actually just penalise the scores, the traits that you've noticed. So you might say they're slightly narrow in the hind legs, and a little bit shallow in the depth of carcass, and a bit narrow in the rump, for example. And then you can submit. So that animal's assessed on all those traits in a very short amount of time, and you can generate the share graph, which will again give you all the information of a breakdown of the animal. So one of the other objectives we had was to try and generate as much value as possible out of this process. It's all very well fine-tuning the process, but for breeders who don't traditionally assess, there's got to be significant value to it. So what we've been able to do is, as I say, make the components of the assessment measurable, and once they're measurable, more things are possible. So, for example, report generation and comparison. So, if you look, for example, at an individual animal report, we can look at a bull, for example, and there you'll see exactly where the animal scored well and scored poorly, and also comparison with the rest of the herd. So the dark orange is this animal in particular, the light orange is the herd average. So you can see this animal scored above the herd average on muscle score, and in fact is above across the board. So this animal has scored is well above your herd average. One of the other great reports is the sire report. So if we open the sire report. I'll do a go through this. This sire has 10 progeny assessed, and you can actually look at the progeny report. So rather than this data reflecting the individual animal, this is the data of his collective progeny. So again, the dark orange is pertinent to the sire. So you can see that this sire has produced above average muscling and finish, but actually is below average in breed character compared to the herd average. And it'll also rank your top sires based on visual assessment. So it takes the average score of all your progeny and actually ranks them in order. So on this database, my most prolific breeder from a visual assessment point of view is number 7166. And you can see exactly where he's strong and where he's weak. And his progeny have scored an average of 7.68 out of 10. So it really does play a significant role in the breed development components. I'll just pop back out of this app. Just get back to slideshow here. So basically, where to from here? As I've said, the app is not currently available, but it's in the very pointy stages of development. So what we're actually doing is working with beta testers to not only troubleshoot the app and refine the bugs out of the system, but also test it with multiple criterias, multiple assessments in multiple environments, and gauge all that feedback and further refine the app before it's officially released. So if you are passionate about visual assessment or have any interest at all, and you'd like to get involved from a beta tester point of view, and I'll be very keen to talk to you. We're looking for sheep, goats, and cattle breeders from all walks of life. And the other preference we have is to actually deal with breed societies and breeding groups in particular. As I said, we'd like to refine the criterion past beef cattle and start making it breed specific, and actually working with breeding groups to tailor criteria that is pertinent to individual breeds and start generating some more reliable data. But any and all feedback is much appreciated. So we'd like to work with a multitude of breeders and just start seeking commercial feedback and refining the app. We're very much pioneering new territory here, so don't profess to have the perfect solution in the first instance. So we'd like to get it out to the market and gauge the feedback. So that is a very quick snapshot of the Classic Mode app, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions, but I think I guess a few takeaways here before we open the floor to questions is that the use of visual assessment is actually generating data that you've not seen before. You can actually start identifying strengths and weaknesses within your herd that would normally take generations to build a data bank of, but you can actually identify that this sire is breeding better feet or better length or better meat than this sire, and you can do that in the first generation, which is not something that's been achievable from a visual assessment point of view before. You also starts accumulating significant data from a decision-making point of view and actually injects invaluable transparency into the sales process. So I've had very positive feedback from purchasers who've been delighted to use the Classic Mode assessment share graph as a guide when attending sales. So they might not buy based on that, but it certainly chops their job down enormously. The breeder or the assessor has already identified the cream of the crop, and they can go directly to those animals and purchase with confidence and actually purchase online with confidence, which has been extremely encouraging. I think that is about my time limit. I hope I haven't excelled that, but I would like to pass to Hilary and deal with any questions that might have cropped up.
Great, thank you, Angus. I hope everyone got all of that. Please let me know if you didn't, and if there's any areas you would like to revisit. As I said, there was a big storm that just went over just as we entered into the webinar, so that affected my viewing a little bit, but hopefully you guys at home were all good. So just before we jump into questions, and if you do have any, please send them through ASAP. Obviously, this is, as I said at the beginning, this is the last webinar for the 2021 webinar series. We will be back for next year. The webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. Tonight's webinar will be available by the end of the week, usually. Now, if you do have to head off early, please make sure you take the time to do the survey that was presented, that is presented to you as you exit the webinar. I'm sure this is a very quick snapshot this evening of both topics, so I'm sure there'll be some feedback on how we can expand on either of those topics into a full webinar, maybe into next year. All right, we've got some questions coming through. The first one for you, Angus. Will the app be able to be used outside of cell phone service, i.e. you can download the app on the device, be it a property with no phone service, use the app to do the assessment and then go back into phone range, etc., etc.?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's number one item on the scope list, and is actually 90% of the reason we haven't launched yet. So the app works seamlessly with internet connectivity, which so it should, but it actually it does assess animals with no internet connection, but it requires you to find an internet connection for the score to generate, which works, but is too clunky for our official release. We've found that you really do need that score validation, especially for new users. You need to be able to use the app and say, okay, that animal's a 7.8, that fits in with what I had in mind, or it doesn't. It takes a few animals to sort of collate your expectations with the score, and you need that score to generate crush side, and currently that's the final piece of the puzzle from an offline point of view. So today it doesn't, but by official launch it will.
Great, thank you. The next question, can we add in a criteria for personal use for stud selection, retaining size and dams for future breeders?
Yeah, that's another great question. There's a multitude of reports there that really only scratch the surface, and that obviously is the opportunity. If we can start developing some criteria that actually starts to help us select future size and future dams, and actually take a step further and select breeding combinations for us, then that's the next step. So that only comes with getting numbers through the system and putting it to use and refining it. So that's certainly the direction we want to head.
Great, thank you. Angus, when do you think this app might be released?
It's been 6 months of development for 3 years. So I am extremely optimistic that it'll be released very early in 2022. I've stopped promising because it's app development is a beast of its own, but it's in a workable form. So anyone who wanted to put it to use could actually use it in its current form, as long as they're open-minded that it does have a few gremlins. But I would say by the end of the first quarter of 2022, it'll be out in full force.
Great, thank you. Peter, I'll throw this question to you. Why is it bulls and not both dam and sire that seems to be concentrated on? Dams could easily could provide scores, etc.
Yeah, I guess from a genetic, I'm sure Angus can talk about it from what Classymate offers for dam scoring. But from a genetics point of view, we often focus on using breeding values for ram and bull purchases. And the main reason for that is what we call the selection intensity is higher. So if you think about each year, you're only buying a relatively small number of bulls or rams comparatively to the females that you're retaining within your breeding herd or flock. So that's why our focus is around using breeding values for bull and ram selection decisions, because that's where you get the most bang for your buck, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Classymate's got a criteria for cows and bulls. I've just demonstrated the bulls there. And for the same reason, bull assessment's got a significant impact on progeny, and therefore that's where a lot of the focus is. But dams are certainly significantly important in any breeding operation.
Great, thank you. The next question is to Angus. Any thoughts on matching photos or scanning function to compare to ideal, and any work with assessing herds or consignments as a group?
Yes, on both fronts. I've actually been in chats with a number of universities about this state of play with not so much photos, but more video analysis. There's a lot of work being done on recording the movement of livestock and generating data on their characteristics. But the days of actually identifying that feet might be slightly turned, or there might be skewed feet or weak pasterns by video are a long way off. So nothing beats a observation of a person who's qualified to do so at this point. So, and with a picture, and that goes for photographs too. The technology's not there to be able to have a photo and get any real, to get a very accurate assessment. Animals have to be moving to make a reasonable assessment. And the second part of the question was around, remind me?
Any work with assessing herds or consignments as a group?
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to, we've already started to scope out a mob assessment. So basically it would allow a breeder to say that there's 1,200 sheep in this mob, and you bring them in and you would draft off 5% or 10% and assess them under a similar criteria, and then it would actually start to develop data that is reflective of the entire mob. So if you assess half of them, you're going to get more accurate data, but if you assess 2%, you're at least going to accumulate some pretty reliable data on what your mob's strengths and weaknesses are.
Great, thank you. Angus, how many files or animal entries can the app hold?
It's unlimited. It's stored on a very flexible server, so it'll just expand its bandwidth with the amount of users. So it can, in theory, hold every animal on Earth, although that's yet to be seen.
Great, thank you. back to Peter, just finally, if there are any other questions that can come through, apart from sheep genetics and breed plan, Peter, are there any other programs or courses that you would suggest the listeners for this evening sink their teeth into to better understand their genetic assessment?
Yeah, great question. So there's at MLA, we're just in the process at the moment of redeveloping our Bred Well, Fed Well package, which is for, there will be both a beef and sheep version of Bred Well, Fed Well. So we're expecting that to be rolled out during next year. Keep an eye out for that. We do have other programs as well. There's the Building Better Breeders project. We also have, if anyone's looking at getting their teeth into a little bit more of the genetics research and development that MLA has going on, we do have our Livestock Genetics Forum, which will be held in Adelaide on the 5th and 6th of April. There will be communication coming out from MLA about that, and that's really targeted at our commercial producers to see how the latest genetics research and development links to their production system. So that's a really good opportunity as well. We do have our e-learning module with MLA. So there's some e-learning modules there around picking a high performance sire and breeding values 101. So there's plenty of opportunities there alongside those face-to-face workshops that we expect coming out with Bred Well, Fed Well next year.
Excellent, thank you. And the Building Better Breeders, I would say, almost is an equivalent to an LTEM course for cattle. So certainly a long-awaited course that's available to you as producers now if you are interested. Angus, just a final question for you. Is there a process to become a qualified assessor?
Yes, there will be. We've appointed some initial assessors based on industry experience, just to engage with breeders, the initial round of breeders who prefer independent assessment. But we are refining a more formal process that will basically accompany a series of workshops that we'll do throughout the country that will involve, day one will be workshops that are open to the public to help them understand the app and how best to put it to use. And the next day will be a more formal process to qualify assessors to make sure they are of the right calibre to perform the task.
Excellent, thank you. Peter, there's another question that's just come through for you. What are your thoughts on the commercial female genomic products in the market, and can you see value in utilising them?
Yeah, good question. So there are a number of products out there, and we're also investing in some R&D around that. So I'll touch on the sheep one. The main sheep product at the moment targeting commercial animals is the flock profile test. So for anyone that's not familiar with that, you genotype 20 ewes of your maiden ewes, and that will give you a benchmark of where you currently sit in terms of ASBVs. And that allows you to go and purchase better rams from there on. That's obviously at a flock level. It combines all those 20 animals into a single number to then go and buy better rams. In terms of beef, though, it is a bit of a different space. There are some products out there that are used for commercial benchmarking of heifers, including say the Heifer Select product for Angus breeders in the south. And that is underpinned by the research behind our breed plan genetic evaluations as well. Given my comments previously to the other question around selection intensity, knowing where the most bang for your buck comes from. So I think certainly there's definitely really good production cases where those heifer products, particularly if you're classing out heifers, work really, really well. We've also got project going in Northern Australia, the Northern Genomics project, which is running with UQ, which is looking at developing a similar genomic EBV product for females in the north. And that we're looking at that as well at both an individual animal level, but also at a herd level, and how we can relate that back to better EBVs so people can buy better bulls, as well as choose better females to retain in their herd. So they certainly do have a place in industry.
Excellent. Thanks so much. All right, well, that seems to be all for this evening. So thank you, everyone, for your questions this evening. Thank you, Angus, and thank you, Peter, for your presentations. Again, in the feedback, if you have any areas you would like us to expand on in any future webinars, please write that down. We need to make sure these webinars are relevant to you as producers. And again, thank you everyone for joining us for the 2021 webinar series. We'll be back in February next year, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, Angus, and thanks again, Peter.
Thank you, Hilary.
Thanks, Hilary, for having us on.